Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really compelling piece by Lawson Akigbe titled Major Chip Hazard Goes to Washington. In this analysis, we're going to explore a pretty fascinating and frankly critical intersection that the author highlights. It's that crossroads where carefully crafted media personas crash head-on into the harsh, unforgiving reality of military administration in Washington. Akigbe gives us this stark, unvarnished look at modern political appointments. So let's break down exactly how this dynamic is shifting the way high-level defense decisions are actually being made.
To really dig into this impartially, we have to start with the core question the author uses to frame the whole issue. What actually happens when governments confuse military aesthetics with military strategy? I mean, how does the modern political stage handle that massive transition from the bombastic, tough-talking rhetoric of peacetime to the incredibly consequential life-or-death decisions required during wartime? Akigbe argues that the line between merely looking like a leader and actually being one is getting blurrier by the minute, and that comes with some potentially devastating results.
To illustrate this, the article opens with this absolutely brilliant parallel to the 1998 movie Small Soldiers. Remember the character Major Chip Hazard? As Akigbe notes, Hazard was the complete package. He had the gravelly voice of Tommy Lee Jones, the swagger of a decorated war hero, and just this unflinching, absolute confidence. He looked, sounded, and talked exactly like a soldier. But beneath the surface, well, he was ultimately just a plastic toy programmed to fight. The author uses this character as a really powerful metaphor for political figures who completely look and sound the part, projecting immense strength on camera, but who ultimately lack the indispensable real-world judgment required when an actual crisis hits.
Akigbe applies this metaphor directly to the current political landscape, specifically examining the Trump administration and the appointment of Pete Hegseth to the Pentagon. According to the article, a move like this represents the ultimate triumph of image over expertise. The piece outlines how cabinet positions are increasingly starting to look more like television casting decisions. It seems loyalty and the ability to project a very specific, tough image on TV are being valued way above actual administrative competence. Hegseth, who is a former Army major and television host, is described by the author as someone who wears the military bearing comfortably and speaks fluently in martial language, but who might really lack the critical nuance needed for such a massive role.
And that brings us to a really specific example of this aesthetic-first approach. Akigbe points to the recent rhetoric around rebranding the Department of Defense back to its pre-1947 name, the War Department. Now sure, supporters might think the word war sounds stronger, right? More decisive than defense. But the author completely dismisses this as a pure branding exercise. After all, calling a hospital a battlefield does not make the doctors soldiers. Changing the stationery and adopting tougher language doesn't magically create strategic geniuses in the Pentagon. It just creates an illusion of action.
Now, what's really interesting here is how Akigbe perfectly contrasts the traits that make someone a successful television host with the traits required to manage a global military superpower. Think about it. The world of television rewards absolute confidence. It rewards unwavering certainty and dramatic headline-grabbing statements. But military reality, that operates on a completely different frequency. War brutally punishes overconfidence. Military history tends to reward caution, and reality demands careful, meticulous planning. The article warns that modern politics is increasingly treating the performance skills of a broadcaster as a direct substitute for the essential expertise of a strategist.
This brilliantly illustrates the op-ed's core warning. Akigbe writes, during peacetime, almost anybody can sound like Patton. During wartime, reality conducts the auditions. It's such a striking point. Recruiting performers works perfectly fine when the stakes are low and the cameras are rolling. But it becomes incredibly dangerous when the geopolitical climate suddenly shifts and reality demands capable administrators who can actually navigate life and death complexities.
So let's move to the next major theme of the piece and see how this argument builds. The author introduces a dynamic he calls the trap of small victories. Akigbe suggests that limited geopolitical operations, the ones small enough to produce great headlines but limited enough to avoid immediate messy fallout, can actually breed a super dangerous sense of overconfidence among political leaders. They start to view military force not as a last resort, but as a quick, reliable shortcut to solve complex political problems.
The piece provides a fascinating historical comparison to really anchor this idea. Akigbe argues that every administration kind of gets its Grenada moment, whether it's Ronald Reagan's intervention in Grenada back in the 80s or Donald Trump's actions regarding Venezuela.
These operations deliver exactly what modern politicians adore: quick images of American power, bold declarations of success, and a flashy demonstration of force rather than the slow, tedious work of diplomacy. But the danger isn't in the victory itself. The danger is the false lesson it teaches. These small wins whisper a dangerous lie, suggesting that all future, much larger conflicts will be just as easily manageable.
But as the author points out, history repeatedly demonstrates otherwise. Let's look at history's misplaced lessons. Grenada was not Iraq. Iraq was not Afghanistan. Afghanistan was not Libya. And Venezuela is most certainly not Iran. According to the article, when seasoned advisors try to point out these vast contextual differences, when they raise questions about using military force as some kind of universal solvent, they are often swiftly dismissed as pessimists or portrayed as weak. The unique, deeply rooted historical realities of these nations are simply brushed aside in favor of an easier, television-friendly narrative.
Which brings us to a critical, gaping hole identified in the source material when it comes to modern military planning. Akakiba calls this the missing chapter. Planners often devote enormous attention to the opening chapter of a conflict, right? The dramatic strikes, the initial invasion, but far less attention, sometimes none at all, is given to the final chapter. The article highlights this specific blind spot when looking at the current political enthusiasm for a potential confrontation with Iran.
Akigbe calls the day after the most neglected phrase in modern warfare. To really drive this home, the author uses the invasion of Iraq as the most expensive, tragic illustration of this. Washington knew exactly how to remove Saddam Hussein. That opening chapter was a swift tactical success. But they had absolutely no coherent plan for governing Iraq the day after. And the result? As the article points out, it was years of insurgency, brutal sectarian violence, massive regional instability, and literally trillions of dollars spent. Knowing exactly how to start a war is definitely not the same as knowing how to end one.
When discussing the current rhetoric around Iran, the author argues that advocates of military action love to eagerly discuss tactical targets and shiny new weapon systems, but they almost entirely avoid this crucial, inevitable sequence of consequences. A conflict doesn't just neatly stop at initial strikes. Those strikes naturally lead to escalation. Escalation brings retaliation, and ultimately you are looking at widespread regional destabilization. Akiba notes that leaders who treat war like it's a tightly scripted television episode completely ignore this highly complex, very real chain reaction. So the crucial takeaway here is that Iran is not Venezuela, nor is it Grenada. It is a drastically different arena. Iran possesses significant, highly developed military capabilities, deep regional influence, incredibly difficult strategic geography, and decades of institutional experience in surviving extreme pressure from larger powers. You simply cannot manage a nation with this level of robust capability using a scripted, reality TV approach to foreign policy. The underlying assumption that the war will be easy and the aftermath will somehow just take care of itself is, according to the author, historically bankrupt.
The author underscores this by drawing a really firm line in the sand. Tactical victories, like winning immediate on-the-ground military engagements, are absolutely not the same thing as strategic outcomes, like achieving long-term political stability and governance. This is an incredibly expensive lesson the United States supposedly learned the hard way in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The architects of those conflicts genuinely believed they were creating new democracies and clean, simple futures, but reality delivered a very different verdict. Yet, as the article points out, Washington appears to promptly misplace this exact lesson every single time a new conflict arises.
As we enter the final act of this explainer, we return right back to where we started, that toy soldier metaphor. Akigbe poses a really tough question. What actually happens when wartime reality finally catches up to political performance? What happens when the studio cameras turn off, the slick PR campaigns stop working, and the actual messy consequences of war arrive at the doorstep? Because in the harsh, unforgiving light of reality, political slogans totally lose their magic. Akigbe argues that a defense secretary is ultimately not judged by how forcefully they speak on camera or how well they manage the branding of their department. They are judged entirely by a set of stubborn, unyielding metrics: outcomes, planning, preparedness, foresight, and a deep, profound understanding of consequences. When it comes down to it, actual competence matters infinitely more than appearances. In the movie Small Soldiers, Major Chip Hazard's fearsome image ultimately collapsed. His booming confidence wasn't evidence of actual understanding. Just as a surge of electricity exposed the cheap plastic beneath Chip Hazard's camouflage, the article fiercely contends that the immense pressures of actual prolonged war will inevitably expose the plastic of any administration built purely on aesthetics and television ratings. Reality has a funny way of short-circuiting performance art. And so,
we leave you with this final, provocative thought drawn directly from Akigbe's text. History has a really unpleasant habit of refusing to stay buried. As we look at the current geopolitical landscape and this apparent prioritization of image over true expertise, we have to ask ourselves, has Washington truly learned anything from Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya before embarking on yet another confrontation? Or will today's leaders continue to prioritize television ratings over genuine expertise, right up until the exact moment reality inevitably arrives carrying a very large invoice? Thank you so much for joining me today, and I really hope this explainer has helped you grasp the profound real-world stakes hiding just behind the political theater.